And hello, everybody. So I had a really good question from a student. So I figured rather than just answer it via text or email rather, or even just putting it on the discussion board, I figured I'd take and put a video on it. And I liked this one a lot for a number of reasons. What I'll end up doing is, let me just bring this in and I will share my screen with y'all. And the question was essentially the difference between permeability and transmissibility of a contact lens. So what we're going to do is talk about dk versus dk over t, or permeability versus transmissibility. So if we did this, so this was the message sent by one of our students, which was really sort of brilliant. And it said, I think I'm struggling with the difference between permeability and transmissibility. And that's a fair question for somebody new to contact lenses. And she then, this student then goes through and says, I think it's their interpretation of what they read, what was in the video, what have you, and then asked if that was correct. And I can't stress to you enough that when you're learning this type of stuff, not only is it a fair question, not only is it a question that is commonly asked when we're teaching this stuff, but the way that you phrase the question as an instructor, as a professor, as a teacher, it can sometimes be frustrating to have someone come and say, I don't get this, just reteach it to me. Well, my question then would be, what did you read? What did you look at? What videos did you search? You looked through our text, you looked through the videos, you looked through the PowerPoints, you looked through the reading. What's your impression? What did you get out of it? And let me sort of corral you, let me point you, let me guide you into the right uh, avenue, as opposed to glancing at it, not getting it, and say, hey, somebody's just going to teach me from scratch again. That one is not a sustainable way to learn. Well, one of the things we should be doing is learning how to be a lifelong learner and a self motivated learner, and then having somebody sort of guide you in the right direction rather than just spoon feed it when you want it. So again, stating what this person thought, this is my impression, or this is what I read, and this is what I got out of it, and I'm sort of stuck. Here's what I know, here's what I think I know, but I'm not putting it all together. That gives me a better framework, or any instructor or teacher, a better framework for what you understand. And sometimes you understand it completely. Perfect. Other times we can see where the error is made and we can sort of go from there. But to say, I don't get sagittal value, I don't get permeability versus transmissibility, start over from scratch, it's just not something that is, it's not a responsible way to look at this. So I wanted to point out that that was really, this question was thoughtful, and it showed that this person really put the effort in to try to understand, but then ask the question when they were unclear. And I can't speak highly enough about that. So let's get started. Permeability, or decay, is a function of the material. And what I mean by that is uh, it's not thickness dependent. It just means I have a material. Give me a material. Give styrofoam, um, steel, concrete, or in our case for contact lenses, let's be more realistic, glass or polymethyl methacrylate. And those are materials that have been used long ago in contact lenses, and they had a number of decent properties, and some were good, some were bad. But one of its failings, some of their failings were it wouldn't allow oxygen to permeate or travel through the material. And so if you have, like, if you tried to breathe through glass, nothing's coming through there. No, it's impermeable to any oxygen or any gases for that matter. Now, if we start developing materials that allow oxygen to travel through the material itself, then we now have this decay, or the permeability of the lens. One of the first lenses we ever learned, the first hydrogel lens, that was Otto Wichterle, if you recall, doing the spin casting with his little erector set, essentially, if you look back at the notes there and the videos and the reading. He came up with hydroxyethyl methacrylate, and this was simply a plastic where if you threw it in water, it would hydrate. You'd have the plastic matrix, but it would absorb water almost like a sponge, but it kept all its other really cool properties. And if you took a fully hydrated piece of this material, 38% of it would be water, and 62% of it would be the matrix or the substrate or the material that you're dealing with. You can dry out. For those of you who have ever left a contact lens on a sink accidentally or seen one that was thrown away or discarded, they're crackly and dry. Well, that has lost all its water, it evaporated. But when you rehydrate it or when it's fully hydrated, a HEMA lens is 38% water. So, and if you look, that used to also be called polymacon, and it really was the foundation, the basic skeleton of which all the hydrogel lenses were sort of constructed off initially. So again, hydroxyethyl methacrylate, 38% water content, fully hydrated. That was our first hydrogel lens before silicone came along. And remember from our lectures before, they used to start doing their little witch's brew. They'd throw other stuff in like N-vinyl pyrrolidone or methacrylic acid or a handful of other types of plastics or additives, which would change the structure of the lens material. And when they did that, say, let's use one for example. Methylphenol A is a lens material, hydrogel material. And what they did is they did the ethylene glycol dimethacrylate. And then they did the methacrylic acid. So they just tossed a little bit of this, a little bit of that, mixed up, saw what happened, did their FDA testing, make sure it's safe, see what it would do. But in this case, it allowed the lens material to absorb more water, a higher decay. Oxygen permeates through that block of material better than just HEMA all by itself. And so that's where we come up with that, the higher the water content, the more oxygen goes through. A higher decay allows more oxygen to permeate that particular material. And that's important in contact lenses because one of the names of the game, good fit, good biocompatibility, it can't have a good coefficient, it can't have too significant a coefficient of friction. You don't want it to be really grippy like sandpaper. You want it to be nice and smooth. But one of the biggest ones, probably more important than anything, is how oxygen gets to the cornea. If oxygen doesn't get to the cornea, obviously we have hypoxia and a breakdown of the physiological processes of the cornea, and we get sickness, disaster, train wrecks, dumpster fires. You get it. So now, a higher decay means that more oxygen is going through, more oxygen can potentially go through that material. So again, glass would be 0, nothing goes through. Hydroxyethyl methacrylate or HEMA, a little bit more goes through as a decay. Well, you'll get into that in a minute. And then the methylphenol here, which is HEMA but with some additives and some different chemicals, it has an even higher water content and therefore more oxygen makes it through, therefore it has a higher decay. The problem we had earlier on, especially in the 80s or so when I started, higher water content, if we were having difficulty with hypoxia, if we had difficulty with oxygen transmissibility, if we had issues with edema, neovascularization, we said, let's just put them in a lens that has a higher water content. Higher water content, more oxygen, voila, all our problems go away. Well, there were other issues like cleanability. There are other issues like sometimes higher deposition issues, because again, higher levels of water sometimes led to higher deposits, less comfort, more inflammation and irritation. Sometimes if we put methacrylic acid in there, you'd have an ionic charge, which would also, it's an ionic lens, it attracts more. So there are different issues and it's more complicated. But for our purposes right now, the water content, if there's more water, that means there's less material holding it all together, the structure itself. And so these tended to rip or tear a little bit more easily. So we'd solve one problem, more oxygen, and come up with another one. Well, in some of these lenses, recall, back in the day, they weren't daily or weekly or monthly replacement. You'd have one pair for the whole year. And if that ripped, that was really a big deal. So in some cases, if it was thicker, if it was more prone to rip, one of the ways you could prevent that was you would make the lens thicker. Well, if you make the lens thicker to avoid ripping, the problem is if you're trying to travel through the lens material, and even if it has a higher decay, if you had a higher decay of one material versus another, but the higher one had to be made twice as thick, there's more material that oxygen has to work its way through. So you've sort of lost the benefit of the higher decay because there's more material to go through. So we have to factor in not just the material itself, but we have to factor in the material itself and how thick is the lens it's going through. And that comes with our decay, which is the material, but then you divide it by the thickness of the lens. And this is the transmissibility. So it's not material, it's material and thickness. And so this is, to be honest with you, a better measure because I could have a great decay, a great lens material that allows so much oxygen through, but if it's 5 times thicker, you've lost the benefit of that property of the lens. So now, one other thing I would argue or just point out, spectacle lenses, different powers will result in different thicknesses. So you would imagine a -1 sphere in a spectacle lens, say in CR39, as opposed to a +9, that +9 is going to be profoundly thicker. Well, the same thing happens with contact lenses. So for example, this is an AccuView Oasis. The link is on the bottom, but if you had a -4, it's 0.07 millimeters. But if I had a +4, it's 0.168. It's more than twice as thick. And if you wanted to see where that came from, this is their little handout. And if you're to look in this document, which are fun to read through, that's actually pretty cool. So you can actually see these thicknesses, and that's where we ended up getting this. Let me move that out of the way. But be that as it may. So this is where I want you to just think critically for a moment. And that is the DK over T. Oftentimes that'll be hyped or advertised, or it will be stated in our lens, the DK over T is fantastic, 100, 140. And remember when they started adding silicone to the equation, and instead of just the HEMA skeleton, the HEMA sort of foundation, and then adding different chemicals, once you started adding silicone to the mix, it really changed the game. Silicone has an incredibly high decay. It really helped the oxygen permeability of lenses, and it really allowed more oxygen through than traditional hydrogel lenses. And remember, hydrogel and silicone hydrogel both are soft lenses, but they are arguably different animals because one has silicone and one doesn't. So one of the questions you should ask is, well, hold on, if I have one lens that's thinner, say that -4 that we had, and one lens that's thicker, say that +4, shouldn't the DK over T change, but that manufacturer told me something different? Well, what I would argue is most of the lenses, and I didn't put in this PowerPoint, but most of these lenses, when you see a DK over T value, it's going to be registered off of a -3 power. If I have this -3, which would be arguably close to this -4 in terms of its thickness, a +4 is arguably going to have a thicker center thickness, and that same lens from that same material, same brand, from the same material, a +4 is arguably going to have a center thickness that's thicker. So this is why I like some of these. I found this J&J Pro website, and they have all of these graphs, and these are all -3 spheres. And what they do is they take the center thickness, and that's normally where you find your DK over T. But they did a little graph, and what they did was, let me move this over a little bit. Get this over here. Let me bring it all the way down. I didn't want to cut that off. There we go. And so if you notice, red means less oxygen or a lower DK over T. The blue is a higher, more oxygen, higher DK over T. And here what you'll notice is this DK of a 34, it really doesn't allow a lot of oxygen through anywhere. But notice how higher DK, the center thickness it allows more through, but the edge thickness on a -3 is thicker, so you're getting less through the edge and further. Even these Biofinities or the night and day air optics with the DK over 140, the DK over T, right here has great, but even that -3 has a little bit less, so you have to not just look at the number, the DK over T, but that's for a -3. If you have a +6 that you're fitting, you have to take into account for your problem solving, your fitting, your lens decision making, that's probably going to get less oxygen into the eye than their reference of a -3. And this is another great one. I liked this one, where this is by power. Here I have a +6, +3, -3, -6, and again, red, these. So you start to notice these different lenses, even with a -3, it's great in the middle, but we get a little bit less because it's thicker off to the edge. And so now you have a 1-day active view moist. For this photograph, they're just looking at them here, 25.5 versus 86. This lens in all areas gets more because it's got a higher DK over T, that -3. But even though this is higher, middle it gets a lot, but off to the edge, because it's thick, you're going to get less. So it's really thickness dependent. I wanted to point for you guys who are familiar with a toric lens or a soft lens for astigmatism. Notice how I have a great DK over T, a high oxygen transmissibility for the center that's really thin, but it gets thicker off to the edges. But we also have this prism ballast. The prism ballast keeps it from spinning. And this will keep the lens oriented correctly, but it's thicker there. So you have to remember, or at least keep under consideration, that parts of the lens are going to allow oxygen through to the eye less than other parts of the lens based on thickness. So that's, in a nutshell, a little bit more in depth than probably I was anticipating going. But I did want to go through the very basics. The DK is a property of the material. 0 DK means no oxygen gets through it, or no gases for that matter of any type. And the higher the DK, the better oxygen can make it through the lens. And again, there's a graph in one of our presentations where if I have a hydrogel lens, the higher the water content goes, generally the higher the DK. So as I go from a 38 to a 55, 55 to 60, and I believe the highest lens DK that I'm aware of right now is, I think, a Nesofilcon at about 78, which means it's 78% water and only 22% substrate. Well, there's a limit to how much even water will let oxygen go through. So higher water content for a traditional hydrogel means a higher DK. However, when we start adding silicone to the mix, something interesting happens, and that is the more silicone I put, the more the DK goes up. But the more silicone I put in, I've got to take something out of the mix, and more often than not, as you put more silicone in, you have less water. Meaning the higher the silicone, the lower the water, the higher the DK. So if you look at a test question that says, if you add higher water content equals an increase in DK, that's only true for hydrogel. But if you have a silicone hydrogel lens, higher silicone means higher DK, but higher silicone pushes some of the water down. So generally in a silicone hydrogel lens, the lower the water content, as the water content decreases, the DK goes up. And that's because the lower the water, generally the higher the silicone. So that's one of those really trick questions to see if you're really paying attention or understand. But this goes back to the very nature, again, the DK versus the DK over T. The initial question was just, what's the difference? But I thought this was a great opportunity to sort of spell some of this out to you. So appreciate it, and I will see you all on the flip side. Appreciate it.